From Capital News, Illinois, federal prosecutors in Chicago are being accused of official misconduct for their handling of cases stemming from Operation Midway Blitz. And lawmakers are working overtime as the end of the legislative session draws near. It's Friday, May 22nd, 2026, and this is Capital Cast. Hello, and welcome to Capital Cast, a regular podcast of Capital News, Illinois. I'm Peter Hancock. It's been another busy week at the State House as lawmakers are nearing the end of the 2026 legislative session. This is the time of year when bills move through the House and Senate like a factory assembly line. But even more activity is taking place behind the scenes where legislative leaders work quietly to put together a budget package that they hope can pass both chambers. We'll get to the legislative action in just a bit, but first I want to focus on another story that took place this week in a federal courthouse in Chicago. That's where a federal judge on Thursday raked the U.S. Attorney's Office over the coals for its handling of a high-profile criminal/political prosecution. She even suggested federal prosecutors could be guilty of official misconduct. And for that, we want to bring in our Chicago reporter, Hannah Meisel. Hannah, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here, Peter.
So this has to do with a group of defendants known as the Broadview Six, not to be confused with the Chicago Seven, although you might detect some similarities there. These are people who were indicted last fall for their role in protests that took place in September against the Trump administration's immigration crackdown, known as Operation Midway Blitz. To set the stage, 6 people were indicted by a grand jury, but over the course of the next several months, the criminal cases began to fall apart. In March, prosecutors dropped all the charges against 2 of the defendants, and late last month, the lone felony charge, conspiracy, was dropped, and so all that was left were some misdemeanor charges. That's all leading up to a hearing on Thursday of this week in federal court. Hannah, what was this hearing all about?
Yeah, well, let me first back up to late April when, you just mentioned the prosecutors dropped all the lone felony charge of conspiracy. At that time, U.S. District Judge April Perry she had requested to see transcripts of the grand jury proceedings that led to the indictment back in October. And this was after agitation for months on the part of defense attorneys. And she was about to request them when, in a surprise move, prosecutors say, hey, actually, we are dropping that felony charge. And because grand juries only consider felonies and not misdemeanors, it was basically a moot point. And so, the judge didn't press it. And so the case was, moving forward to a very rare federal misdemeanor trial that was scheduled to begin on Tuesday after Memorial Day. And on Monday, the judge held a pretty lengthy pretrial conference. And at that time, she agreed to take a look at the unredacted grand jury transcripts. And apparently what she found in those unredacted transcripts made her pretty upset because I believe on Wednesday she called, she scheduled a hearing yesterday. We are, of course, recording on Friday morning, or afternoon rather. And in a closed door hearing on Thursday morning, she basically took prosecutors to task and said, what she saw in those transcripts. She said, I have read hundreds, if not thousands, of grand jury transcripts. I have never seen the types of prosecutorial behavior before a grand jury that I saw in those transcripts. And what she said, she identified basically 3 problems. Number 1 was what is known as prosecutorial vouching, which is when a prosecutor basically uses their title and says, I wouldn't be bringing this case to you, the grand jury, unless there was something here, to kind of sway them to indict. Number 2, there was apparently improper communications between one or more grand jurors and a prosecutor outside of the grand jury, another huge no-no. And also, maybe most critically, after the first of three grand jury sessions, there were apparently some members of the grand jury who felt strongly that the government had no case, perhaps even walked out, it seems, by the characterization that we see from the transcript of yesterday's closed hearing, which was released on Thursday evening. And, those people were basically like asked not to come back um, because they disagreed with the government's case, according to the judge. And all
Okay,
of these
so
things.
the judge is reading this during you talked about a closed door hearing that took place Thursday morning.
Correct.
And then later on Thursday, she releases a transcript of what took place in that closed door hearing, which is how we know all of the stuff that took place. This U.S. Assistant U.S. Attorney who's at the center of this, Sherry Mecklenburg, the one who is essentially being accused of doing all this. Tell us about her. What was her role in all this?
Well, she seems to have been the lead prosecutor on this case. She was basically a 20-year veteran of the Department of Justice. And she had been, the one leading the hearings up until February, when she actually left for, it seems, a temporary assignment as a DOJ staffer on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. But just as we were getting set to record this podcast, U.S. Senator Dick Durbin, of course, Illinois' senior U.S. Senator, who's the ranking Democrat on that committee, released a statement saying that he shared the judge's concerns and that her detail assignment has been terminated.
And so all of this is being overseen, of course, by U.S. Attorney Andrew Boustros, who is President Trump's appointee to the U.S. Attorney's Office. He essentially is the Justice Department in Chicago. What was his response to these accusations that the people underneath him have basically been engaging in official misconduct in order to bring charges against these immigration protesters?
Correct. Yesterday I saw something pretty remarkable, I feel. I'm not sure I would ever see it again in my career. But the U.S. Attorney took the extraordinary step to go in person to Judge Perry's courtroom to basically take responsibility for this prosecutorial misconduct. This was in an open session Thursday afternoon following the closed session that morning. And he said, that he was also very upset and that he had also never, I too, quote, he had not seen conduct like that, and it upset me, which is why we dismissed the indictment. And he's talking about a few weeks ago. He claims that back in October, at the time, he did hear about the dismissal of the grand jurors, and he says he addressed it at that point by basically starting over with a new set in the second grand jury session. But he was unaware of the alleged vouching and the improper communications outside the grand jury room until late April. And at that point, he basically said we had no choice but to drop the felony conspiracy charge. But at the same time, though, even though he was taking responsibility and, defending also the remaining U.S. Assistant U.S. attorneys that have been working on this case for their decisions on what to redact in an earlier version of the grand jury transcripts that the judge had read a while ago, saying, I don't think that anyone intended to mislead you. He then, though, kind of switched tones and defended the charges that he had just said that the office was going to drop. And he said that, in a civilized society, no one should be attacking a federal employee, whether it's a judge, a member of Congress, or, yes, even an ICE agent, which is, the person at the center of the protest back in September, basically on a Friday morning, September 26th, in the early weeks of Operation Midway Blitz, these protesters were outside of the ICE facility in Broadview, and an ICE vehicle drove through the crowd at a low rate of speed. And he said, it's by the grace of God that the agent only drove 2 miles an hour and didn't panic, didn't step on the accelerator or pull out his gun and shoot somebody. And, that in addition to kind of mischaracterizing the judge's ruling earlier this week to not take the jury on a little field trip to the Broadview site, it really angered the judge. And so she said, you're really undercutting your mea culpa here by continuing to defend, by standing behind the charges and continuing to vilify these particular defendants. So again, and some interesting history here too is that April Perry was President Biden's pick to become U.S. attorney, but J.D. Vance, who at the time was still in the Senate, had blocked her appointment, and she instead became a federal judge late in Biden's term. And, here we are now with Andrew Boutros as Trump's pick for U.S. attorney.
Okay, and so this judge has some history with the Trump administration, or at least people who are now in the Trump administration, including Vice President J.D. Vance.
And I should also mention she was the judge who oversaw the case that the state of Illinois, city of Chicago, had filed to block the National Guard from being deployed in Chicago, which basically ended in a victory for the state of Illinois at the U.S. Supreme Court in December.
Okay, and then I want to ask one last thing about this. One of the defense attorneys mentioned during this hearing, according to your reporting, the hardships and expenses that the defendants have gone through during this prosecution. There is now a new fund that President Trump has set up as a result of a wholly separate piece of litigation he had against the IRS. It's a $1.776 billion fund supposedly set up to compensate people who believe that they have been victims of a weaponized Justice Department. Any chance that these defendants, in this case, might apply for compensation from that fund?
Yes, in fact, one of the defense attorneys, Chris Parenti, who was representing Oak Park Village trustee Brian Straw, said that they would explicitly told reporters after the hearing yesterday that they would. In addition to seeking what's called Hyde Amendment sanctions against these prosecutors, he said, so they could get their money back. Spending on defense attorneys. He said that we also want to make a claim under this DOJ weaponization fund, quote, if you want an example of weaponization, you have prosecutors going into the grand jury targeting political candidates and political figures improperly. These guys should be Exhibit 1 to get part of this DOJ weaponization fund, and we're going to be seeking damages as well. At the time, I think now we kind of take it for granted, but this Broadview Six, most of them were candidates or are local level elected officials active in Democratic politics, including Kat Abu-Ghazaleh, who in March came second in a very crowded race for Illinois' 9th Congressional District to replace retiring Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky.
Hannah Meisel, thank you so much for your reporting.
Thank you, Peter.
And now, turning back to the State House, this was another busy week in Springfield. Both the House and Senate were in session. There were lengthy sessions on the floors of both chambers as lawmakers pushed through bills ahead of the Memorial Day weekend. And of course, May 31st is the scheduled end of the session. But that was just the action that we could see in the open. As I mentioned earlier, other conversations are taking place that we don't see. And for that, I want to bring in my colleagues, Ben Zelensky and Brendan Moore. Ben, let's start with you. The budget is the biggest piece of legislation that lawmakers deal with each year. Governor Pritzker has proposed roughly a $55 billion general revenue fund spending plan. Where are we on that?
Yeah, so we're about 7 days here away, 7 session days away from actually passing this piece of legislation. So right now we're kind of at the point where final decisions are being made on it. This isn't really deciding if the big program is going to be there or not. So lawmakers, at least on the House Democratic side, were polled twice this week about various taxing and spending options that can be flexible within the budget. These are some of a few of the more small dollar items on spending or potential tax increases. Nothing that's like a income tax increase or anything like that is being floated. So that's kind of the point we're at. We're in the final decision making process. Leadership is trying to take the temperature of the members to see what they're supportive of to get enough votes to pass this over the finish line. And I think we'll probably know more towards the end of the weekdays of next week.
Okay, so the governor proposed what was basically a fairly flat budget compared to last year. There are lawmakers, especially within the Democratic caucus, who are not quite satisfied with that. They would like to see more spending and some additional revenue. I think some of the more creative revenue pieces included tax on digital advertising and maybe a tax on social media companies. What sort of temperature, what's the temperature of the legislature on those kinds of things?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, at this point, the digital ad tax has probably got more momentum than anything else progressives have proposed. This is one that has been discussed a few times. It nearly made it into the budget last year. And it can kind of get at the same idea that the governor's proposed social media use tax was getting at, which is, making these giant internet companies pay more for doing business here in the state of Illinois. You can kind of frame your argument in favor of that under that umbrella. The problem, though, I think that a lot of lawmakers are going to get some hesitation over as far as the digital ad tax goes is, will it impact small businesses? And the business groups, say that a lot of these small businesses, they're going to be subject to this digital advertising tax because that's really where they do most of their advertising. So I think that's certainly going to give some folks pause as to whether they move forward on that. Other things like taxing billionaire assets, some of these other things aimed at corporations and super rich people, those are probably not going to move forward this year. I think if we're going to see anything else major on the revenue front, it's probably going to be something a little bit more like, closing some of these things between the federal government and the states where, the corporate tax code is aligned with the federal tax code, and that's helping to decrease corporate taxes here in the state.
And Brendan, let me turn to you. As we're going along, especially the last couple of weeks, we see the Senate seems to be able to produce a lot of legislation, and they don't waste a whole lot of time doing it. Has it felt like the House has been a little bit more disorganized, like maybe they're not gelling quite the way they might need to as we're getting toward the end of the session?
I don't know if it's more than in the past. The House is generally kind of more of a rambunctious body, and specifically the House Democrats. They've a very fractious caucus, and Speaker Welch, ever since he's been in charge, has practiced lowercase d democracy. They really try to get consensus before kind of going out and backing a plan or a proposal, which is a little bit different than the process in the Senate, where the Senate president kind of wields more of I guess I would say authority, but it's more of an orderly process. And we've seen throughout the session that the two chambers, especially the Senate Democrats and the House Democrats, have kind of been operating in silos from the most basic stuff like the session calendar They have not been in alignment, and we're seeing it on some of these bigger bills, such as an effort to regulate artificial intelligence. The Senate passed a package earlier this week, but it's kind of unknown if the House is going to take up those bills, if they're going to do their own thing. And we've seen that in a few other cases. And another case would be the Bears mega projects bill. The House passed a bill last month. The Senate is trying to work through and pass their own plan. There's a lot of planes that they have to land next week on a lot of these big issues, and it remains to be seen. I think they will get a budget that they've been able to do that every year, but they only have, I think what Ben said, 7 session days left. Not a lot of time to get a lot of these issues sorted out.
Well, and something that seems to happen every year is that the budget hinges on maybe dozens of other things that individual legislators want. You pass this thing and I'll vote for your budget bill. And you just mentioned one of the mega projects bill, which is a high priority apparently for some legislators, maybe not so much for others. This would be state incentives for building very large developments, such as major league sports stadiums, for including possibly a new stadium for the Chicago Bears. There was a little bit of news about that this week. Why don't you fill us in there?
Yeah, there was and there wasn't. It's one of those weeks where there was a lot of talk earlier in the week. Governor Pritzker was asked about Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson's efforts to try to keep the Bears in the city. And to be clear, the Bears have said it's either Arlington Heights or Hammond, that there is not a site that they can build in the city. And the governor basically said the mayor had no plan, and the mayor responded, basically said the governor can't relate to why he wants to keep the Bears in the city, that his background as a billionaire means he can't relate to working class issues, and for him this is a working class issue because a Bear Stadium would be a lot of jobs in the city. Wants to keep those from going to the suburbs. But then later in the week, we heard from the top Senate sponsor or negotiator on the mega projects bill, Senator Bill Cunningham, who basically said that the Bears had lost some ground, especially with Chicago legislators, because apparently there was a meeting last month between the city and the Bears. Apparently these were the attorneys that were talking. The Bears say they were just talking about their current lease at Soldier Field, but the mayor at least interpreted it as, or used it to tell Chicago legislators, well, the Bears have shown they may be willing to re-engage and build in the city, or be open to building in the city, which would maybe take some votes off the mega projects bill. But we heard yesterday from the Bears, they said it again very emphatically that there is no viable option in Chicago. Again, a statement they made before, but they made it again yesterday. I think it was more so as a message to the mayor and a message to Chicago legislators that, if you don't pass this mega projects bill, there still isn't a path for the Bears to be in Chicago, and that they would probably go over the border to Indiana, where they have an incentive package that would basically give them more than $1 billion to build over there. So a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes. We haven't seen a bill yet emerge in the Senate. We know there are going to be changes, but it's unclear what those changes are going to be. They want to do some type of property tax relief that's meaningful in there, but how to get there is kind of a difficult. It's kind of difficult to get there, given how that might hurt the incentive and defeat the purpose. So it's going to be a difficult. It's going to be a difficult plane to land next week. I think that there's a desire to get it done, but it's not an easy path to get there.
A lot to watch for in the days ahead. That's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation. My thanks to Ben Zelensky and Brendan Moore, and of course Hannah Meisel in Chicago. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.